Is it time to dismantle some doctrines? If you don't know what that means, then come along with me. I'm Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Bible college teacher and pastor of more than 20 years. Join me as we deconstruct whatever dogmas and beliefs have held you behind, and together work to reconstruct and rebuild your authentic self. Hey everyone, welcome to the special edition of the Dismantling Doctrine podcast. This is a conversation that I'm going to be bringing you. I've actually bumped a couple things around. I was going to bring you the episode with Sanae Shea talking about Christianity and conspiracy theories, but I've had a chance to speak with two authors, Marissa, Burt and Kelsey, Kramer, McGinnis. They are the author of a book that's going to be coming out really soon, so I wanted to help them promote it. It is called The Myth of Good Christian Parenting: How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families. And I just spoke with these two ladies the other day, so I wanted to bring you this episode really quick because I think the book is coming out around the middle of October. You can actually pre-order it on Amazon now, but it'll be coming out very soon. This is a really good kind of a poignant discussion with Marissa and Kelsey because, of course, talking about my book, Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, I described growing up under what I consider the Bill Gothard cult, where my parents were subscribers to his theology. They patterned both their marriage and their child-rearing strategies on people like Bill Gothard and Dr. James Dobson. And this is something that we talk about in this episode. And one thing that really struck me was they both said, the truth is back when parents like mine, back in the 70s and 80s, they were the sort of first generation of people who really bought into this idea of quote unquote Christian or godly parenting. And there were whole empires built and still being built on this idea of selling books and seminars and conferences on raising children God's way and all this kind of thing with a guaranteed outcome. But we now have case studies. We now know that this is a myth, and this is something we're going to get into. And I myself, and I'm an example of one of these children who now as an adult, I was raised in this sort of context 30, 40 years ago. And I'm one of the case studies. So this was kind of a poignant conversation. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation with Marissa, Burt, and Kelsey McGinnis. What's coming up, though, in the next couple of episodes, I wanted to mention before we get into this conversation with these two authors, I'm going to go ahead and bring you the conversation with Sanae Shea, taking off the tinfoil hat, which is her moniker on social media. We're going to be talking about Christianity and conspiracy theories. We take a really deep dive into that. Then I'm going to bring you a conversation with a guest that I had years and years ago, Stacey Ray from Canada, and we had a really fantastic conversation, really talking about this idea of narcissism, narcissistic relationships. How do you know if you're in a narcissistic relationship, an abusive relationship? And then we got into this idea of, is the God of the Bible a narcissist? And that's a fascinating conversation. So look forward to that episode with Stacey Ray coming up really soon after the one with Sanae Shea. And then I've got a couple other recordings booked in the pipeline. I'm still working on getting a date with Catherine Stewart. We're going to be talking about her book, Money, Lies, and God. So that's coming up hopefully sometime, maybe in October. She's having some scheduling issues right now. And then I wanted to mention too, speaking of my book, Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, How Bill Gothard Church and Family Taught Me Christianity Doesn't Work. Of course, you can find that on Amazon. There's also the Audible version, the one that I narrated, which I've heard a lot of feedback on that book. People said it's really good to hear me doing my own narration, telling my own story of what it was like. Now, this is a really cool announcement. I'm going to be on Frank Schaeffer's YouTube channel on the 7th of October. So if you missed that date, it's going to be at 6 p.m. UK time, 1 p.m. Eastern time. But you can always catch that conversation. Frank is going to be interviewing me about my book on his channel. So check out Frank Schaeffer's podcast on YouTube. We're going to be doing a whole episode just devoted to this book. So that's really cool. And we're going to be running a 99-cent sale just in honor of me being on Frank's show. So if you wait until the 7th or 8th of October, you can pick up a copy of the book for just 99 cents on Amazon. So that's a really cool thing. And then also we had a really good conversation the other day with Mikey Bridges. This was our Dismantling Doctrine podcast Zoom call. I think we're going to have Sanae Shea coming back in the month of October, talking about Christianity and conspiracy theories. This is just a really good benefit you get for being a Patreon supporter of the show. You get to meet returning guests and talk to them for an hour. And I think I'm going to try to have Marissa and Kelsey on. We're trying to work on a date maybe in November. We'll see if I can have them back on, and you get a chance to talk to them for an hour and ask them questions about their book. Maybe you were raised in a Christian home like me, and now you're suffering the effects of that. So I think this discussion will be a really helpful one for you. All right, let's get on into this conversation, talking about the myth of good Christian parenting. I'm going to interview Marissa Frank's Burt and Kelsey Kramer McGinnis, talking about their brand new book coming out soon. I'm super happy to be joined by Kelsey McGinnis and Marissa Burt. Thank you, ladies, for coming on the Dismantling Doctrine podcast.
Thank you for having us. Excited to be here.
Yeah, delighted to be here. Thank you.
This is amazing because you both come out with a book. It's called The Myth of Good Christian Parenting. And I love the subtitle, How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families. And we were just saying before we hit record, that sums up so much just of my upbringing. I talk about it in my book. I was raised under Bill Gothard Institute and Basic Youth Conflicts, as it was called then. So I'm curious, just what led you to write this book? Were you both raised in sort of a Christian context as well?
I was, yeah. I was raised in what I would call kind of normie evangelicalism in the U.S. My parents were on staff with Campus Crusade for Christ for a while during my childhood. Grew up going to big SBC, Southern Baptist Convention churches, or EFCA, Evangelical Free Church of America, youth group culture, worked at a Christian bookstore, the whole thing. I've got the whole trajectory right there.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. And similar.
You must have the same, Marissa.
Yeah, I think really anyone raised in American evangelical Christianity is going to brush up against some of this. I had a hodgepodge background, went to Protestant churches and Catholic school, but even in those environments, parenting teaching, kind of like Christian marriage teaching, is remarkably ecumenical. So I think it just seeped into American evangelical culture in a number of ways.
Mm-hmm. What's this idea? Okay, you say the myth of Christian parenting. What is the myth? What's the thesis of the book? Because obviously I don't want to give too much away. People need to read this book, especially I think it's kind of like two audiences in a way, isn't it? Those who are like me, maybe you two, who were raised in this context. But then you talk about Christian parents who now perhaps regret having raised their children because of a whole host of issues, which I'm sure we'll get into. Is that who the book is written for primarily, would you say?
Yeah, I mean, I think we had a couple audiences in mind when we wrote it. Certainly people where it brushed up against their own stories and had resonance. So both adult children reflecting back or parents reflecting back. We also hoped it would help people who are currently parenting and saying, what of the Christian resources out there, I don't know if I want to do that. Like, this is not a parenting advice book, but we wanted to help them understand maybe some of those resources. And also we had in mind people who are maybe helping people process, therapists, spiritual directors, pastors, and others, to help them understand the context that a number of people were raised in. Because I think if you were outside of these communities, sometimes it can feel like a completely different language that was going on, but was really formative for a number of people.
Absolutely. What would you say? Would you say, Kelsey, that it was a similar kind of a thing? I mean, because this whole, what's the myth? What is that myth? What's the promise that parents were supposed to be grabbing a hold of? That was there some sort of guarantee that if they raised their kids this way, then they would turn out a certain way? What's the myth behind the whole thing?
Yeah. So I'll say there are like a lot of little myths, but I think the big, like, over them all is this. There is a one godly biblical way to parent your children, and if you do it right, they will not depart from that way. You know, the train up a child in the way they should go. That's the promise. The promise is kind of twofold, that there is a right way that God wants you to parent your children, and that if you do it, everything will be okay. And all these authors have different ways of articulating what it means and then everything will be okay. Like, some of them will articulate that differently or pull on different fears or anxieties in order to make that case. But that's the big myth and promise. And then underneath that are lots of other little ones that shape the way these authors of these books encourage parents to tackle certain problems, and we can get into all of those.
So wait, are you saying that if these parents raise their children according to some sort of formula that it didn't work? I'm shocked because it didn't work for me.
Yeah. Say everyone you knew, it worked out exactly the way everyone would. Yeah.
And the myths really pulled on two levers. They exploited parental fears. A lot of these books are filled with very vivid descriptions of how things could go wrong that usually track with the social panic and anxiety of the day. But this horrible outcome may happen if you get this wrong, and pulled on the aspirational longings. That's why we like the language of myth for that, that said, if you get this right, you could have a generational legacy. You could maybe change the course of your community and even the nation if you do this right. So really pulled on some of those longings. And we also think of them in kind of terms of prosperity gospel parenting promises, because they really do come with that guaranteed, because these ideas were presented as quote unquote biblical. So the idea being you can trust the word of God. Therefore, if you do this right, you can expect this outcome. So then when it doesn't work out that way, it's user error. The fault is you. It's not the Thomas. It's either the parent did it wrong, or there's something uniquely wrong about your child that this didn't work for them. So it comes with a lot of shame and isolation for people down the road when the receipt comes due.
Yeah, you mentioned, okay, there's some biblical allusions. You mentioned, raise up a child the way he or she should go. When they're old, they won't depart from it. I mean, I was raised in all those good biblical principles: spare the rod, spoil the child, all that kind of thing. The rod of discipline. Foolishness is bound up in the heart of a child. The rod of discipline will drive it far from it. I mean, I can still quote these verses decades later because I was raised with that idea that if the parents follow those principles according to the scripture, then the child will turn out a certain way. But we are saying that doesn't always work. Why doesn't it work? Because then who is to blame? Is it the parents, God's fault? Is it the fault of the Bible, the translator? Who's actually to blame here?
I think one major problem with these books is that in many cases, they are telling Christian parents to hold their children to an impossible standard. That, mainstream parenting experts of varying kinds would look at these and say, okay, expecting first time obedience all the way every time with a happy heart, or all the way right away with a happy heart, is just not a realistic expectation of a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old. But these books tell parents, like, actually, no, parent, it is your job to require obedience and require respect. And by not accepting any excuses, not accepting anything less, you can make this work. You can ensure order in your household. You can ensure that your children learn how to respect authority. There really is this level of like reject anyone who tells you otherwise. Like reject anyone who tells you that your child might not be capable of that. They are. And so, the question, whose fault is it, is kind of a wild question, because the promises these books are making are just simply not grounded in like any understanding of early child development.
Child
You know,
psychology.
yeah. I mean, even though, James Dobson himself is a psychologist who, increasingly rejected kind of mainstream advice as he aged. But I mean, part of the problem is these expectations are totally unrealistic. Like, even to the point that we don't expect other adults to function the way these books tell parents to expect their children to comply, right? It's this completely detached, non-relational way of relating to children that it just sets everybody up for failure.
Yeah. And I think there were some other things going on in the water when some of the most popular resources were produced, including a view of the Bible as not just inerrant. You have the inerrancy movement happening around this time, but as kind of like an instruction manual for life, like a user guide. And that came from Jay Adams and the Nouthetic biblical counseling movement. But it seeped into a lot of Christian self-help that really had people going to Bible verses, often proof texted individual Bible verses, and holding them up as timeless wisdom for modern parenting situations, like as a how-to guide. And this leads to all sorts of problematic places when you talk about from a perspective of biblical interpretation. But practically speaking, then you have people creating whole methodologies around motivated interpretations of like a proverb from the ancient Near East, right? So they're kind of creating these whole structures and to serve some of these ideas about authority and obedience and compliance and ordering of a right society, and then presenting them as timeless. So when the question does come later down the road, when people are asking who is at fault here, they do think of these few options. Well, either the child was so strong-willed or the parent really screwed it up, or maybe Christianity is this oppressive system and it's the problem. And so it really continued that either or thinking that's so prevalent in communities of high certainty, that it's either this way or nothing, or either this way or everyone's a villain. And it just kicks that down the road, and maybe it takes different forms, but it really keeps people stuck, thinking, okay, well, if this isn't the right way, I was on the wrong way, and that just, it can be really a heavy yoke for everyone to bear. There's an expectation that everyone should be obeying immediately, including parents, that the whole system kind of runs on, even though that's more subtly implied in these books. Like, this is what you parents need to do to be safe and make sure you're not going to receive some kind of cosmic punishment in a certain sense.
Yeah, so there's a couple of levels here. I'm hearing you both say that on the one hand, it's a behavioral expectation, isn't it? The parents say, okay, if I raise my children according to these quote unquote biblical principles, they will act a certain way. They will be good kids. They won't have problems. They'll avoid issues in life. Obviously, then you get into things like the evangelical purity culture. They're going to remain virgins until their wedding night and all these other things. But then what's the ultimate outcome? Because we say, okay, if there's a myth here, someone like myself, I'm an ex-evangelical, and a big part of my decision to walk away from the faith was my upbringing, which is what I talk about in my book, how Bill Gothard Church and Family taught me Christianity doesn't work. So that is all related in everything. I think you'd say religious trauma syndrome, rapture anxiety. Those are the long-term effects of children like me and perhaps you two. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, this is like a fundamental problem with these resources, is that they tell parents they have more control over their children than they actually do, and that their children have less autonomy than they actually do. A lot of these resources, you come away with the impression that these are like pre-humans almost, right? They're programmable. And there's so much dehumanizing language used for children and used for teaching children, used for how you discipline children. And parents come away, or they can come away, with this expectation of control that you simply don't have over another human being. And these resources don't grapple with that adequately. They tell parents over and over again to seize control, to protect that authority. Like, you have the authority. God has given you the authority. You must protect this authority. And I think any parent who's honest will say, like, okay, I cannot force my toddler to not scream.
Yeah.
I can't make them not scream.
Anyone would just figure that blank?
Can try to coerce my child I can try to scare them into not screaming. Then the question becomes, how far are you willing to go to coerce your child into doing something? And that's not control, though. That's sort of saying, like, if you don't have that kind of control over your child, you're doing something wrong. You're not adequately coercing the proper behavior from them. But it leads to this very distorted view of children, of the personhood of children, the autonomy of children. There is no room for boundaries, language of boundaries, that the children are capable of making decisions, or that they're capable of encountering God on their own terms, or that God can encounter them on God's own terms. Like, there's no grappling with that. Parents are the mediator. And so there's so little room for respecting the separate identity and free will of children. And that, I think, can send parents for a loop later on when they don't turn out.
As well as the kids and when they grow up.
Absolutely.
Yeah, because
absolutely.
in the short term, it can appear to work sometimes when children are small. And spanking is often the only or primary tool given. So yes, you can coerce compliance. And what we observed to be quite common is then down the road, when adult children do reclaim their autonomy, they do step into their personhood in a significant way, there are no skills for parents to navigate that. Like, it becomes the road, because parents have practiced and trained themselves up to expect unquestioning compliance. They have believed it works because they've seen cheerful external compliance, whatever's going on inside. And so, sometimes for older parents, it's confusing. Like, what happened? Like, it was working. My child was walking with the Lord. What happened? Why in their 30s and 40s are my adult children going low contact or won't let me see the grandchildren, right? It's confusing. And for adult children, we heard from a number of adult children saying authentic relationship with my parents is impossible because they have no tolerance for differing opinions. They have no tolerance for anything but their own perspective. So it really leads to inauthentic connection or estrangement, because a great deal of the future of the relationship depends on ability to pivot. But the people in most need of that are the least equipped, because it's not just the harmful teaching these resources offered, it's what was absent. And what was absent was respect for another person's personhood, learning how to listen, learning how to hear a child disagree, things like this that just were not tolerated or were not tolerable. So it really leaves a lot of families stuck in very painful relational fallout. It's why we say this teaching betrayed entire families, because often it was confusing for adult parents to discover, oh, I trusted these spiritual authorities,
Mm-hmm.
and whatever their intent, parental intent may have been, the impact was devastating. There are very real consequences to parenting this way. And in some ways, when you look at what was the advice given, if it was consistently applied, it's a recipe for estrangement and disconnection.
Mm. Yeah, the exact opposite of what the parent intends from the beginning. You don't want your children to be estranged, because I am estranged from my mother. I had to cut her off about 10 or 12 years ago because she was so toxic, and that was the sad legacy of the whole end of the whole thing. I was going to ask you, do you get much into Christian homeschooling? Because I came into this from another angle as well. Years ago, I was researching Christian Reconstructionism,
Nope.
R.J. Rushdoony. And of course, he's, I guess you could say he's the father of Christian homeschooling in America. You could say he's one of the most influential, if not the most influential person, sort of pioneering Christian homeschooling and Christian day schools. But there was another myth, I guess, that associates with that sort of model, because Rushdoony's idea was if we just raise up enough generations of godly children, eventually we'll take dominion over the world. And so there's a promise built into that. Did you come across that sort of dominionist? Because to me, that is shot through from anywhere from now. You got guys like Doug Wilson and even now Pete Hegseth. Okay, he's a super prominent person. He's a member of one of Doug Wilson's churches. So you've got these whole generations of kids. Did you come across this idea of dominionist theology? Because that's shot through with all this stuff, I think, as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a couple of thoughts, and then I want to hear from Kelsey on this as well. Like, so many of these resources circulated via homeschooling networks, right? Family life teaching is a big draw. It's, as I mentioned, it's remarkably ecumenical, and a lot of ministry empires, for instance, Doug Wilson's Canon Press, a huge element of that is family life teaching, because that draws families in and kind of cements that connection. And certainly you have people like Doug Phillips of Vision Forum as well in the late 90s and early 2000s, all of these guys pushing for really their version of Christian nationalism, saying things like the Joshua generation can win back the nation for Christ. And this happened earlier to a certain degree with Dobson, who really was a prototype for all of this and paved the way for it. But those aspirationals became, I think, a defining mark of the majority of American homeschooling culture. I mean, certainly you find other elements of it, but I think most families, if they went to a homeschooling conference, they came across Rushdoony's ideas and Doug Wilson's teaching. And many people were introduced to more fringe characters like Doug Wilson through parenting resources, because someone they knew at church, handed them this, or interested in classical education. And now all of a sudden they're reading about dominionist family life and are all in on patriarchy. So, I think it's a big problem. I find it really troubling that they continue to circulate. They continue to get platforms, even though none of this is theoretical. Now we have generations of people saying, well, this is how it turned out. Like, it's not an excuse, but in the 90s, some of it was still like, well, we don't know. Maybe this will change the name. Now we're like, no, the fruit of this is families are destroyed and people are exiting the church en masse, and the fruit is right there.
Yeah, we got a couple generations in, and this is the fruit of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not theoretical anymore. That's a really good point.
Yeah, that's right. 'Cause now we have case studies now. And we have generational data. And we also have cultural evidence as well, that things did not go the way they thought they would, even for all the sort of victory that the religious right would have claimed in the 80s and 90s, or at least thought they were heading toward. And one thing that's interesting to me about the dominionist stuff, going back to Rushduni, I think Christian Cobas Dumais does a great job of making the case that this has morphed over time and worked its way into unexpected corners of evangelicalism. Because, James Dobson, especially in the beginning, was not foregrounding like the Bible in his writing and teaching. He was very much foregrounding like cultural conservative ideas, Nixon law and order messaging, those kinds of things. But he did echo the same message of parenting and family life as a social and cultural project. This was not a matter of saving individual families. This was not a matter of healthier, happier homes. This is a matter of impacting culture, of righting the ship of American culture, Western culture, however he was articulating it and whatever it was he was writing. And it's a very similar way of thinking, but at least in his earlier work, it had a much more political sheen to it than a religious one. Became more religious over the years in terms of how much he would bring in scripture and proof texts and these kinds of spiritual lessons. But there's resonance there that might not have read as immediately as like religious zeal, but it is very, there's a lot of common ground there, I'll say.
Yeah, it certainly leaked into the religious right. A lot of people have written on that. No one may know the name R.J. Rushdoony today in, like I say, a Trump evangelical advisor or something like that. But his ideas have baked in. What about this idea you mentioned? I think, Marissa, you used the word empires. I wanted to go back to that because, and in the book, you talk a lot about this. I mean, the empires that I'm familiar with, the ones I was raised in, like you said, Dr. James Dobson focused on the family, and then now the Family Research Council. And then I was raised in the Bill Gothard, which was then called Institute in Basic Youth Conflicts, which is now IBLP, Institute in Basic Life Principles. And of course, a lot of people have become familiar with this through Shiny Happy People, and now the sequel to that. And that's why I named my book Not So Shiny, Not So Happy People, to try to twist on that, But these were far from the only people who built actual empires. How does that relate to this whole discussion? Because we're talking about mega millions of dollars as well. There's a lot of money flown in as well.
There is. And yeah, millions of dollars. I think Dobson we mark the beginning of the explicitly Christian parenting print and media market with Dobson, because I think he really showed how successful this could be. I mean, pastors and others had been speaking about parenting for decades before that, but he really found his moment, used multimedia effectively, saw that there was an eager audience, and built a global ministry on that very quickly. I think Dare to Discipline sold a couple million copies in its first few years. By the end of the decade, Focus on the Family had started. Bill Gothard similarly found a lot of ecumenical traction with selling out stadiums and then producing all of these resources. And then you see others doing that in smaller ways. Gary and Anne-Marie Ezzo did the Growing Kids God's Way and Babywise, the secular counterpart Empire, in the late 80s, early 90s. They claimed at the peak of their ministry that 70,000 churches were having weekly meetings where their curricula was being used. So they claim to have reached 3 million, I think is what they claim to have reached globally. You have people like Ted Tripp, who wrote Shepherding a Child's Heart in the 90s, which is still popular today, building a publishing arm around a very successful resource and creating a number of other resources. And sometimes these experts were bolstered by others, like John MacArthur gave Gary Ezzo his platform. And once these people found traction, often they were good speakers, they were good communicators, they maybe were charismatic in personality. they achieved market success and that became their credential, right? Like a lot of them didn't have any particular relevant expertise beyond their own parenting experience, maybe. But once they sold enough books, they became household names that sometimes built international ministry empires. And that's where we kind of saw people moving after maybe they received criticism here, if they did, like Gary Ezzo, or looking for new markets. We saw them eyeing global ministry markets, kind of like Shiny Happy People shows in season 2, where if they were, if platformed people receive pushback here, they feel called all of a sudden overseas. And so we heard from a number of Christians from around the globe who said, "Oh yeah, well, James Dobson's still very popular in our church, or people are still very much recommending TED Trip." So things that maybe in America have come under critique in recent years are still very popular globally because it's almost been exported with a missionary kind of impulse.
A missionary zeal. Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that, would you say, on this issue of empires?
Yeah, I think it's just like a really great example of how the evangelical enthusiasm for using media comes with all kinds of downstream impacts, right? Like, parenting is such a weird thing because there's really no such thing as a parenting expert. Like, you can't get a PhD in parenting, which that lends this world to like kind of anyone who can convince people they're trustworthy on the topic. If you can create a platform and convince enough people, you can kind of become a parenting expert. And evangelicals have long been in favor of harnessing mass media for evangelistic means. And what you get, though, with that is a combination of things in the parenting world. One, a complete lack of expertise, but if the person is good enough on screen, on radio, in their writing, they can convince you they have that authority. And that's what we see with these empires. It's not unlike how the influencer sphere now, the politics of authority on the influencer sphere are so complicated because your appearance and your lifestyle and your persona are all part of how you gain authority there. To say anything you want, to say all kinds of things. And that comes with all kinds of potential problems, as we are now seeing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking, as you were mentioning, the classic Exhibit A is Bill Gothard. The man he never had children, and yet it didn't stop millions, literally. I mean, I went to the seminars when I was a kid at the Seattle Center. My parents were part of the host and hostess committee, so they were actually involved in the leadership of the organization when he came to Seattle. They were really into it. All my sisters went when I was the youngest of 5 older sisters. I couldn't wait till I turned 13 to go to the seminar and fill out all the blanks in the workbook. I mean, it was a massive spiritual milestone. And he was charismatic. He was funny. He was very well spoken. He was obviously educated, and millions hung on his every word. And millions obviously raised their children according to his quote godly biblical principles. And I was going to mention, because you mentioned, Marissa, I think you talked about spanking. One of the things, the legacy I was raised with, I was spanked thousands and thousands of times, sometimes 2, 3, 4 times a day when we were, quote, naughty, me and my sister Beth. And there was a theological aspect to it, original sin. We have to, the rod of discipline will drive that foolishness far from the heart of the child. And it was a thing of, they were going to help us break our proclivity to sin. That was a big sort of aspect of where it came from. Did you find that sort of shot through a lot of this material that you researched as well? Yeah, it's everywhere. I mean, the Mike and Debbie Pearl, blanket training little infants. I mean, that's shocking stuff, isn't it? Spanking a baby for crawling off the blanket. I mean, that's crazy.
It's everywhere. And I am over and over throughout the process of writing this book, amazed at how many parents will go to bat for the practice of spanking as like as a central tenet of raising a child according to the Bible, according to God's will.
That's what it says. Spare the rod, spoil the child. And if you don't do it, you actually hate the child. That's the thinking behind it. The parent who doesn't actually hates their child because they're allowing that girl or boy or whoever it is to, go on into sin, I guess. You're trying to break the will of the child. That's what Gothard taught. You're here to break the will of the child. I mean, that's abuse to me as a parent myself. I think I never, ever did that to my girls, ever. That wasn't my aim as a parent.
Yeah, and it really enabled so much abuse. And community enabling and community grooming was a piece of this because it normalized that for everyone in the community, said this is the project we are on. In fact, if you refuse to spank, there's probably a problem with you. I mean, we've heard from people who were excommunicated for questioning spanking. This really is the thing, especially over 2 years of researching and talking to people, that people will double down on and defend vigorously. I think there's a lot of reasons for that, including sunk cost fallacy, fragility, defensiveness. I mean, there's a lot of reasons. But we call it in our book, we talk about spanking as liturgized spanking. We kind of try and differentiate it from something maybe James Dobson in his early books would have recommended, which was a very utilitarian, behavioristic, like you spank a child so they stop doing the bad behavior, which, has been in American society outside of the church for a number of years. But yeah, in a lot of these resources, what parents were told was something with a much more sacramental feel, that it was what God wants you to do. So that kind of gave parents a pass for any of the guilt or concern they may have felt, right? Like they might have felt like, I don't feel good about this, but no, this is, God wants me to do this. This is somehow distinct from hitting a child into compliance. This is a spiritual task. And they were given very specific rules that said, this is how you do it, quote unquote, right, which I think staved off any criticism that would be coming from the growing body of research that was saying, man, there are harmful outcomes from spanking. We see that it contributes to problematic behavior and all sorts of negative things. And Christian parents would say, well, no, that's secular. That's there to distract you from God's way. And almost directly told God's ways are higher. So you need to spank on faith. And so then they would follow these liturgies, and it's just so incredibly dangerous because when you pair that with beliefs that a parent views that they're an agent of God, that they can and should expect instant compliance, and the tool that they are given is spanking, yes, it ends up with all-day spanking sessions and all manner of abuse that we saw recently as people were describing their experience growing up in Dobson homes just a few weeks ago. And it's happening behind closed doors. It's happening in communities that tolerate this, whether it's by people preaching it from the pulpit or church bookstores selling spanking implements. Like we heard from a number of people, that was the case. Churches that had discipline rooms in their church building. And
Wow.
there is a lot to reckon with that I think, I am still a Christian. And as Christians, we need to say, Christian teaching enabled this. Christian communities enabled this. Like, yes, individual families were doing this, but this teaching gave them license. And when parents, maybe there were abusive parents who were drawn to these approaches. And also, there were maybe parents who were looking for God's way. They were new converts, new Christians overwhelmed by parenting, and they were given this and trusted these experts. They maybe intended something else, but we need to be honest and say whatever that intent was, the impact was children were abused in God's name. And that is a very difficult thing, I think, for people to digest who were part of these communities. Yeah.
Yeah, those of us who suffered at the hands of abusers, thinking they were doing the right things, and those who did abuse their children, perhaps unwittingly, because I think that's something you talk about in the book, isn't it? That this book is written for parents who now maybe are estranged from their children, and they're thinking, but I was just trying to do the right thing.
Right.
I was overwhelmed. I can remember reading those books as a young Christian parent with me and my now ex-wife, but we were kind of, like you said, desperate. We didn't know what we were doing. No, there is no manual, as it were, Dr. Spock's book, and here's how you raise a kid and they'll turn out perfect and never have any problems. So you're thinking, okay, well, look at all these great, wonderful resources. And a guy like Dr. James Dobson actually had a PhD in child psychology. So he must be an expert. He had to have been, you think. And he's dispensing all this sage and wise advice, writing best-selling books. So yeah, we're going to read Dare to Discipline and all this kind of stuff, or in The Strong-Willed Child. and these are bestsellers, so yeah, it had a massive damaging legacy for at least a couple of generations now.
Yeah. Yeah. As we've talked more about this in recent months, I find myself struck by this baptizing of the practice of spanking as something that is sort of commanded by God, and that we cannot let this go. Like, letting this go would be to give up something that is so integral to constructing Christian families. The timing of that is also interesting because prior to 1970, I would say, you don't see this this ritualized understanding of spanking. Like, it had always been the norm that parents considered it their right to hit their children. And you have examples like in literature where a parent who is out of control violent with their child, that's looked down upon. It's seen as like a parental outburst that they have the right to do, but it's sort of a moral failing. There was not this impulse to jump in and defend the practice of hitting your children as a command by God. It was sort of like something we can do because children don't have rights and parenting is hard and it's not that serious. Like, I mean, it truly was like a feature of society that people were not defending with the spiritual fervor we see now. That is new. That kind of tone to this conversation is new. And this begins around the time we're in the wake of the civil rights movement, where just coming after second wave feminism, there is new language around rights, autonomy, all of these big ideas. You have the UN trying to get ratification of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which the US still has not signed. It's like this particular thing for some Christians has become like this last stand. Some people, the civil rights movement, they see it as like a last stand against government overreach into the nuclear family, right? There are people who in the 70s were convinced that the liberals want to dismantle the nuclear family. And if we let them take this practice as somehow, if we let them take this practice or tell us we can't spank our kids anymore, that's going to be part of that creep of overreach. And we're all going to lose our children to the government. There's like some real catastrophic thinking, but you can kind of see how in that swirl of change around rights language and social justice language, there is this panic. And it comes around the time where there are some really controversial books about the nuclear family and some changing thoughts about gender roles in the home. I mean, people are panicking, and it's just, I want people to put the conversation about spanking in that context, because in that way, it's this strange thing that has become the thing that we've doubled down on, I think, in reaction to all those other things, with a very ahistoric view of how new and strange that is.
And I would add to that, there's also theological incentives, similarly, that are tied into new theological interpretations. You have a lot of these resources when they're role playing spanking, or they're role playing the theology behind spanking. There's an idea that the parent is standing in for God, that the child is somehow being spanked in the same way that Jesus was, or that Jesus took our spanking on the cross, or it goes to all sorts of really weird places quickly. But it's very much tied into penal substitutionary atonement, which historically speaking is a relatively new understanding of the atonement, but often it's the only one. A very rudimentary version of it is offered to evangelical families as the gospel, period. And so for some people, spanking is also at the core of their Christian faith, even though it sounds weird to say that, because if you start questioning spanking, it leads to other questions of like, well, what does that say about the goodness of God if he is most concerned with someone being punished for disobedience? Like, really? Is that good news that he kind of doesn't care who gets punished as long as somebody gets spanked? And so it can lead to a kind of faith deconstruction that I think for some people is very disorienting, particularly if they have been formed in communities of high certainty. And I think as a result, they often will really defend spanking because there's this idea that what we're doing here is teaching children how to obey God or how God interacts with them or something about the gospel.
certainly shapes your view of whatever God is. Well, I'm aware of the time. I've got two last questions. If you got a minute, you could take. Maybe we can touch on them really quick. But one of the things you mentioned in the book that so much of this was aimed and is aimed at white. It's written by white people, aimed at white evangelical families. Is there this cross-cultural issue? Because what if you're a different ethnicity? What if you're a different background? How does that relate? How does that play out? What did you find in your research in terms of this sort of predominantly white evangelical market?
Mm. Yeah. I mean, this is kind of partly because of the core audience of Christian publishing in the US, right? Like these books were written by and marketed toward white evangelical congregations. Now, of course, there's some crossover, but that's the primary readership of this material. And it's also the subculture that I can speak into from the most knowledgeable place. And it's also, like we were just saying, this is relatively new, and this kind of liturgized spanking is sort of unique to white evangelicalism in the US in a outside the US, there are a number of, and I'm sure as you know, like most European countries have outlawed spanking. You can't spank your children there. And we hear from people in Europe who are like, second, American Christians can just hit their children? Yes.
The defending it, and yeah, it's a hill we're dying on for sure.
Yeah. So to some degree, yeah, that's who we're talking to, because these are the people still reading and applying these books. Uh, And, the question of like spanking as a countercultural practice or of corporal punishment is a complicated one because it certainly shows up across cultures. But again, almost as this like feature of society because children are the property of their parents and don't have any rights. Like it's a relic of thinking that has not contended with children as having rights and autonomy, and it simply not being ethical to hit other human beings to teach a lesson. And, we're very clear that that is, progressive thinking in terms of how we conceive of human rights has progressed in the past 200 years. And I don't see that as a problem. I don't think it should be a problem for Christians to contend with those changes and to consider the fact that they are good changes. And I will say we do get the question about within the US, how this figures into cross-cultural conversations within the Black church, because there are some racial differences in how conversations about spanking and corporal punishment take shape. And for that, I usually refer people to the work of Dr. Stacy Patton, who has talked about the relationship between the legacy of slavery in the US and corporal punishment and the colonialist underpinnings of these practices as they've been visited on communities throughout the world by Western Christians over the years. So that's generally where we direct people, but we also do mention in the book that this is something that is like weirdly specific to white evangelicalism.
Yeah, oddly specific. Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that, Marissa?
All of that? Nope. I would say the same thing. Yeah, that was
You
great.
covered it really well. Okay, then the last question. We've identified kind of, I don't know if the word victim is too strong, but two groups of people who have been like seriously affected by this. So the parents who raised their children, as we mentioned, who now regret and are saying, wow, my children are estranged from me, or they walked away from the faith. They're desperately sorry and sad about how they raised their children. What do you say to them? And then what do you say to someone like myself? Okay, I was raised in this context. I consider it was abuse on a lot of levels, spiritual, physical abuse, and other sorts of abuse, and anxiety, and all sorts of religious trauma syndrome. I'm now dealing with the after effects of that. It's a big reason why I did walk away from the faith. So what do you say to someone like myself who was raised in that and just said, no, I'm packing the whole thing in? What do you say to those two groups of people?
I mean, first, I would say I'm so sorry to both, and as someone who's still in Christian community, to you directly and to others to say, I'm so sorry from Christians that this is what happened to children entrusted to Christian families. It is incredibly heartbreaking to bear witness to, and it is a very real thing with exponential consequences. And there's a lot to grieve and be angry about and lament there. But I think it's important that the Christian community collectively say, we enabled this and it was wrong. And we need to listen to survivors who came out of this rather than blaming them, which I think tends to be the knee-jerk reaction, is to blame them or for it somehow. Yeah, or to say you're the problem. And yeah, and when I hear that, I hear those same messages that just say, stop whining, children. You should be there to rise up and bless your parents. So why aren't you blessing the church? Exactly. And so I would say that we intentionally do not get prescriptive in this book for obvious reasons. We do have a section in it kind of saying, where do we go from here? And we really do encourage people to seek out qualified help that they trust, to say licensed mental health professionals, qualified spiritual directors, pastors with relevant experience, any number of people in the helping profession might help you explore some of this, explore family of origin things, explore how that impacted your understanding of relationships and your way of interacting and your perspective on God. So that applies also to older parents. I think for older parents, would also say all of that. It's time to get curious about what drew you to these teachings in the first place, why you found them so compelling, and why you had difficulty walking away, if you did, why you didn't trust your intuition, your parental intuition. So kind of to extend that invitation to get curious. And also to say there's grace for parents too. Like, the reality isn't that if you made a mistake, there's a cosmic spanking awaiting you too. Like, there are very real consequences to some of these things. And also there's the ability to listen authentically, to hear from adult children, to attempt repair, to learn new skills. Don't know. There's not a one size fits all. Don't know where that takes people, but it begins with naming what happened, with listening to the individual people in your family, because that's one of the things missing from all these myths is who is the individual in front of you, that individual child who was entrusted to your care. What are their needs? How did they experience this? Because even in some families, siblings had different experiences. So it requires kind of a kind of deconstruction on a number of levels that is humble enough and courageous enough to say, whatever I intended, I could have been wrong. And how do I name that and own that in a way that is prioritizing connection over being right?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in there. Would you add anything to that, Kelsey?
I would just echo that last part, that humility to consider that you were wrong. That's something that I hope that I have when my children are adults. The mistakes I don't see now. Of course, it will be painful, but I think we interviewed a number of people, and I think for many of them, a real source of pain is having parents who cannot contend with having maybe made some mistakes or following bad advice. It's especially difficult when that advice has been sold to you as the biblical way, right? And you still are a Christian who considers the Bible to be authoritative. But I think stepping into that relational view of this and considering that this was wrong, that this was bad advice, I think is something that will help, especially will help parents who are kind of struggling to figure out why things turned out the way they did. And that's really hard. We don't want to heap shame upon parents who did this, who practiced these things. But for those who are looking for answers or looking for a way forward, that I think is kind of the only way through and forward.
Yeah, it's a great way to end it, I think. So the book is called, again, The Myth of Good Christian Parenting, How False Promises Betrayed a Generation of Evangelical Families. Is it actually out now? Where can people find it? And then how can they get a hold of you too? If they said, okay, Kelsey, Marissa, I want to follow this up. I want to talk to you. Is there a way to find you on social media?
Yeah. The book comes out on October 14th from Brazos Press. You can pre-order it now. We actually have some pre-order bonuses if you pre-order it, and both of us in our links on Instagram and Threads, if you go there, you can go to a form where you can enter your information for that pre-order, and we'll send you some downloadable stuff that isn't in the book, particularly about the case against the biblicism of corporal punishment. Marissa has put a ton of work into those, and they're fantastic. And there just wasn't space for them in the book, so we're giving them out now.
Yeah.
So you can order from anywhere. Actually, orders from anywhere help us, because when you order from somewhere like Amazon or Barnes and Noble, you read a review there, and those always help us.
Yeah, absolutely. And then how can they find you on social media? Is there a page for the book, a website, or
There
how can
is
they know all of it?
There's not a website for the book, but I'll send you some links if you'd like to include any in your show notes. But you can find us across social media by our names. You can Google us, you'll find us. And we have been talking about these ideas for the past couple years while we've written the book. So if this topic interests you, you can find a whole archive, kind of like a virtual appendix to our book, where we are talking about some of these individual resources and going a little deeper. So we'd love to connect with you there.
Yeah, a lot of that content lives on Instagram. And I should say, we also did a limited run podcast called In the Church Library over the summer as we were wrapping up edits on the book, with stuff that we didn't have room for. There was a lot we didn't have room for. The like word count is just, man, it really snuck up on us. So there are some deep dives on individual resources that are in the church library. So if there's Shepherding a Child's Heart or the Ezos books, we talk in great detail about those. So you can find those wherever you get podcasts.
Well, that sounds amazing. Yeah, it's a great resource. I mean, as we've identified, there's a bunch of people who need to read the book. Parents who raise their kids in this way, who maybe now regret it and are struggling. Parent or children like me who were raised in it and that had all kinds of issues. And so that's a whole nother generation as well. I was thinking too, if you're interested, I'd love to have you back. We do our Dismantling Doctrine podcast Zoom calls. We could maybe get you back in, because I think there's a lot of people who would love to meet you too and have a good, hour-long discussion. So I can send you some dates and we can figure out if you were interested in that. But I think that'd be fantastic. So I'd love to have you guys. Yeah, it's really good. It's just an hour, about the third Sunday of the month. We do these every month. So yeah, it's going to be really good. So I'll hit you up with some dates so we can chat. But thank you so much, Kelsey and Marissa. This is a really great resource. So thank you for your work. Thank you for spending almost an hour now talking with you. I've really enjoyed it. And we'll touch base again. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much. This was great.
Yeah, thanks for having us.